All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. That marks the 12:05, at least Central Time mark. First off, everyone, thank you so much for joining and welcome to our webinar, Identity Resilience and Cybersecurity, Keeping Your Critical Systems on Track. We're going to have a great conversation slash fireside style chat. For everyone that's tuned in, if you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box and not the chat box. And then hopefully, if time permitted, myself and our awesome panelists will be able to get to those questions if the time lets us. So speaking of awesome panelists, we'll go ahead and start. My name is Casey Jennings. I'll be the moderator for today. I'm the Director of Business Development and Alliances at Tevora. Mark, go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, Mark Broken, I'm the VP of Security Architecture at Tevora.
Bob,
I
feel
can
free to go.
I can go next. Yeah, hey, my name is Bhavin Patel. I'm the Manager of Information Security and Business Continuity here at Tevora. Brian, pass it to you.
Yep, my name is Brian Keane. I'm an Information Security Associate on the ISO team, and I mainly support our business continuity disaster recovery practice. Jerry, hand it off to you.
Yep, thanks. I'm Jerry Miller. I'm the Director of Product Management at MightyID.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And then for those of you who are not familiar with Tevora and MightyID, I'm going to kick it to Mark real quick to do a quick overview on Tevora and then pass it right over to Jerry to do a little bit on MightyID. So Mark, feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I appreciate it. So Tevora's been around for about 20 years, 1,200 clients. We do thousands of engagements each year. Really focusing compliance was one of our first practices that we developed. As I said, we've been around for 20 years. That was the first practice we created and started. Largely focused on doing gap analysis for specific controls. Might be payments, PCI, governmental, SOC 1, SOC 2, or unified assessments. From a privacy and risk perspective, it's really helping develop and write policies, risk program creation, for highly regulated organizations. We do some third-party and privacy program design as well. Pen testing and IR is really around our threat services. So we do both proactive and reactive. So that might be a compromise assessment, might be tabletop exercises, breach and digital response, red team, blue team, and then pen testing on app, IoT, physical. And then cloud security and security solutions, right? This is where we're performing services around well-architected reviews from architecture, automation, and we really take an advisory type of approach. And then security is really around SecDevOps practice, right? So we're implementing specific security stack solutions to help increase your security posture as a whole, and kind of doing value-add tool rationalization and planning as needed to help our clients.
And Jerry, we'll kick it to you for MightyID.
Great, thanks. MightyID is a relatively new company. It focuses on identity provider, business continuity, and compliance solutions to ultimately provide identity resilience around faster recovery times from errors and attacks on one or multiple IDPs and tenants. And that includes failing over to another identity provider if your primary provider is unavailable for whatever reason. So our backup and recovery features really are intended to meet your identity provider BCDR compliance and operational needs for your most important cybersecurity assets, which are your user identities and access configurations. In addition to that, we have some change detection and auditing features to really around enabling shorter recovery time. So really our whole solution is built around getting your business back up and running as fast as possible.
Thanks, Jerry. All right, guys. So with that, we'll go ahead and start the Q&A/fireside chat. Mark, I promise I'm not picking on you, but we'll start the first question off with you. Why are IAM platforms so critical to businesses?
Yeah, Casey, good question. The simple answer on IAM impact is revenue and reputation, right? What started off as effectively like username, password to access controls has really been driving more around, hey, it's a revenue impact, right? Whether it's revenue generating applications, whether it's on the workforce side, whether on the SIAM side, it's around B2B or B2C applications, right? We're talking about SSO and IAM. It's handling authentication, it's handling authorization. From both of those, workforce and SIAM use cases, you're talking about securing those applications and making sure that you have effective ways into those platforms. Otherwise, obviously, the business impact can be critical, right, from that perspective.
Got it. Thanks, Mark. So, Bob, and what Mark just highlighted there, from a business continuity standpoint, you come from a deep background in business continuity and disaster recovery planning. How does single sign-on and identity access management relate to BCDR?
Yeah, there's a big correlation between the two. So as kind of Mark just mentioned, SSO is kind of your main primary source of accessing your tools and technologies within an organization. So that allows the employees to do business, right? So if employees don't have access to SSO, essentially they're not going to be able to come in and do the work they need to essentially run the business. So the importance of having a good SSO and critical SSO in place is really important. Business continuity, disaster recovery, for those familiar with it, is the concept of creating a recovery plan for some of the critical systems, right? So that being said, typically organizations like to create a business impact assessment, a BIA. As a part of that BIA, typically what we do is we identify technologies, business units, vendors, tools, and resources that are important for each business and each business unit in order for it to be up and running. If there's any impact to that specific business unit and the technologies and tools were not available, then the business impact assessment will help identify what is the impact of that. So at the end of the day, the BIA, once you complete that, you will have a list of your top critical technologies, business units, and tools that are necessary for your business to run. As we typically look at those BIAs, we typically see that SSO IAM solutions are at the top of that list, right? As I mentioned earlier, if SSO solutions are not in place, most employees won't be able to do their work. So there's a big correlation between the two, and that's also why it's really important for organizations to have a good BCDR strategy in place to build a resilience program specifically for their SSO and IAM solutions in place.
Got it. Thanks, Bob. And so Brian, as Bob just kind of mentioned here, a BCDR strategy is obviously a valuable tool. What should companies look out for when putting together a plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on top of doing the BIA, I would focus on three main areas to really define. I would recommend that companies look at defining leadership's roles and responsibilities in the BCDR program, and then defining processes for BCDR testing and training. And then also lastly, defining like disaster recovery procedures for critical third-party vendors and suppliers. So I'll go back to the first one. So it's really important to make sure that executive leadership is on board with the BCDR program. So essentially getting their buy-in. So just making sure that they understand what the BCDR objectives are and how the BCDR program is going to benefit the company is really important, because then they'll be more likely to allocate resources to support it. So a BCDR program needs things like tools, technologies, funds, and then competent staff. So I'd suggest, in order to get leadership on board, like inviting at least one member of leadership to champion the BCDR program and to actively be involved in things like yearly assessments like the BIA, and then also be part of like annual testing and training of staff. So usually this is like a CISO or a chief information officer. And then the second thing we see companies kind of miss is having well-defined processes in place for doing regular tests and training. So regularly scheduled like training is super critical for ensuring that the plans are supported by staff that are competent and they're ready to go to perform their assigned roles and responsibilities when a disaster occurs. So, and then when it comes to technology, it's important also to do regularly scheduled disaster recovery testing, because it validates and it confirms that defined recovery objectives are still achievable for each resource. So, for example, like if an organization says that it can restore a system in like 8 hours, then it should have planned tests to prove it. And then testing and trainings we usually see for staff are things like drills, but more commonly, we see companies do tabletop exercises. And these aren't just good for training staff, but they're also good for just uncovering any gaps or weaknesses in current BCDR plans so that organizations can address them and then come up with a plan of action to remediate those and improve the program. And then last one I'll touch on is going back to the disaster recovery plans for suppliers and third-party vendors. So something all organizations should take into consideration is just having a backup plan for any services or solutions provided by a third party or critical vendor. And one common thing we see is that organizations, they won't have a secondary backup vendor in mind or alternative operations to transition to while they're waiting for their primary vendor to get back up and running. And this is mostly because vendors, they promise in their contracts, their service level agreements, that they have things like 99.99% uptime, or they have redundancy in place or high availability. So it's very unlikely, they have a reputation of being very unlikely to experience an outage or disruption themselves. But even when it's very unlikely that your vendor is gonna experience an outage, or even when the recovery procedures are technically the responsibility of the vendor, it's important for organizations to have to plan for the worst case scenario and to have that backup vendor like identified or established, or have alternative operations ready to go. So those are the main three things I would focus on when putting the BCDR plans together.
Well, that's awesome, Brian. Thank you. So, Bob, and kind of to piggyback with what Brian just went over, what are some effective disaster recovery strategies that can be used for an SSO or an IM application?
Yeah, good question. Typically, it varies organization to organization, but what we see most are four critical items that we typically see across the board. The first is obviously doing regular backups, right? So organizations should have some form of backups in place, defining kind of the frequency of the backup, whether it's going to be daily, weekly, monthly, etc. The types of backup, is it going to be incremental, differential, or full backups? And then also regularly testing those backups just to ensure that if anything were to happen, those recovery capabilities can be pulled on. A lot of times we see organizations having backups, but they never really test them. And if there's any event that occurs, then they're not able to actually recover from it because it was never fully tested. The second item is high availability, right? So in the cloud environment nowadays and just technology, it's really important and easy to kind of deploy high availability, whether that's essentially in multiple regions, multiple locations, multiple data centers, whatever it is. The end result of high availability is just to make sure there's no single source of failure, right? If everything is tied to one source of truth and that goes down, what really is going to happen? How are you going to bring that business back up? The third item is automated failover. This kind of ties back into high availability and backups to a certain extent, right? So if you have automated failover capabilities in place, you really don't have to worry about manually spinning up new items or switching services to different resources and locations. That's already natively built into it, so it reduces some of your downtime. And last but not least is disaster recovery as a service. So essentially using some type of third-party technology or third-party service to help back up your critical data to a cloud service provider or other tools. Essentially, when you're doing a disaster recovery as a service, you have a third option, right? So if your technologies and tools are down, you can rely on the cloud service providers or technologies to kind of help and assist you with that. That being said, one thing I want to keep in mind is that none one of these are independently good. You have to kind of combine all of them together to create like an effective resilience program. So each organization just needs to consider these items along with all of the different tools out there to create an effective resilience program, to create an effective BCDR strategy.
Thanks for that, Bob. And thank you for segueing that perfectly right into my next question. Mark, what exactly is identity resilience?
Yeah, thanks for that, Casey. And I think one thing that I want to note on, right, is what Brian and Bob both talked about, right, in terms of a BIA, right? A lot of the statistics and studies show 60 to 80% of attacks are identity based, right? So when we talk about backups, we talk about those things, right? Being the fact that it's identity based, right? Accessing data, trade secrets, identity resilience really does come into play, right? And so identity resilience, it's not just about the identity provider, but it's really about securing and reducing or minimizing the single points of failure you have across that identity infrastructure, right? So we're not talking about backing up a single authoritative source, right? And the fact that we still have conversations about, hey, what's your authoritative source is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because there's multiple data sources and multiple identity providers that many organizations have. So it's very similar to what you do for your data centers and data and applications today, right? And Bob had mentioned like regions and zones, right? Today's cloud is designed to have multiple regions, multiple zones. Do you have those same types of layers of protection from an identity perspective, right? So, I heard a lot of backups, I hear backups, I hear zero trust. It's not necessarily just those things, right? So when you're talking about identity, authorization, authentication, the directory itself, if one leg of that falls, you're really in trouble, right? So you got to make sure, again, you're securing and as best as possible building resilience around all those different identity providers that you likely have, right? Many organizations have multiples in place today. So that's how I define resilience identity.
No, that's perfect, Mark. Thank you so much. So with that, Jerry, I think that goes perfectly with the next question. Why is identity resilience and identity security such a hot topic?
Well, it's the reason why we're having this webinar, right? But as you know, Mark and others have mentioned, look, the high value of identity data and the critical business function that the identity and access management vendors serve in this ecosystem that we have today mean that their identities are increasingly the target of serious security incidents, right? I mean, it's where the attacks are going, as Mark mentioned. It's where the mistakes are happening. Everything's integrated in with these systems, which makes them both more complex, changing more often, and then you add automation and integration on top of that. It just becomes a little bit of a change monster, right? And which makes it even more difficult to detect when there are unauthorized changes. And the recent breaches and the resulting outages of these systems indicate that the attacks are getting not only more sophisticated and more common, but they're becoming more tailored to identity services, which means you even need better detection and faster responses than ever before. Look, the shared responsibility model for cloud services is not new, right? Ultimately, it says that cloud customers are responsible for the integrity of their data and the service provider is responsible for the service being up. So your service can be up and your data is not accessible, but your business is down, right? And so that includes basics like, data backups, which we've been talking about, but change monitoring, breach detection, all of these things are your responsibility ultimately as the customer of a cloud service. And these gaps have always been there. It's just that the identity space is increasingly learning kind of this the hard way, which is that, hey, we don't have another source of truth for our data. We don't have offline backups that can't be compromised during ransomware. We don't have a good ability to detect good changes versus unauthorized or bad changes. We don't have a way to detect when these more questionable behaviors are happening, such as the recent attack to the hotel chain, where they were able to get access by resetting MFA. I mean, that should have been a trigger to someone. Yes, they could have done some better safeguards around social engineering. Of course, we always, when you talk about customer service, you always talk about identity verification, and yet we don't really do as good of a job as we probably could, especially around privileged access requests. And so, ultimately it's around making sure that you not only can try and start the barbarians at the gate, but assume they're going to get in someday, somehow, and you need to have a plan for dealing with it then. That's really what identity resilience is all about, being resilient to attacks after they've happened. And so, the other thing you need to think about is it's not just when you talk about recovery or you talk about resilience or response, it's not, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't want to wholesale revert of everything back to some known good state 2 weeks ago, because most businesses can't tolerate the loss of 2 weeks of changes just to revert some mistake that happened, last week that they just found today. And so you want the ability to be able to do these more targeted restorations, these more targeted recoveries, figure out exactly what the scope of the impact is, and only revert those changes. You don't want this wholesale database, reset back to, as I said a week and a half ago, because you lose everything. So it's something else to think about. When we talk about resilience, it's not just, yes, we have backups. Yes, we have a plan that says we will revert backups if something happens. It's how would you actually use that backup for specific scenarios? We hear about vendors who a bad script was deployed that wipes out all of the user departments. Well, you don't want to revert everything just to be able to restore this one field for some of your users. But that's really, that tends to be the most common option that we see today. So, really thinking about from a resilience standpoint, is it practical and is it going to be useful in the scenarios that you expect to encounter?
Thanks, Jerry. So for this next question, if I had my crystal ball, I'd be willing to bet a few of you guys would want to put your 2 cents in. But Mark, I'll start with you. What are you seeing from an operational perspective in the market?
Yeah, good question. And I think what Jerry just hit on is really what we're seeing, right? So you start going back to the shared responsibility matrix, right? So many consumers have a identity provider, right? And there's been some new outages, right, across, different identity cloud providers in the past, right? And that's kind of the nature of the business. But having experienced either just a regular cloud outage, organizations are really starting to understand, hey, we need to worry about our identities here as well, right? So the term identity fabric starts to come up, Casey. Like, what is the how am I going to ensure this mesh of my identities and any data synchronization are effectively coming together? So what I'm seeing is like, hey, maybe we're worried about a single provider. Maybe we need to start building out a plan, as Jerry mentioned, from a resilience and making sure we're backing up all of our IDPs that we have, because they're all controlling different components and different pieces. And in fact, there's a couple of providers that just recently announced some steps to kind of take towards that, right? Understanding that there is a market gap, right? And I think that's the first level of understanding. So you're starting to see people really starting to research. So I think a lot of it is, some of it's about educational, but some customers, as Jerry mentioned, are starting to feel the pain, right? So I think we'll start to see this trend kind of pick up a little bit further and gain more steam over the coming weeks, months.
Anyone else like to add to that question?
I mean, I can add on to that a little bit. I mean, as I said before, MightyID was specifically founded to, kind of help with this identity resilience plan, right? And it is a tool, which means the tool is part of a larger plan. That plan has to include, both process elements as well as, people and training and, all these other things. But it is important to use technology to the best that, you can. And so, this lack of some of these tools that Mark mentioned, is really what MightyID is for, right? So the ability to do backup and recovery of one or more identity providers, having this emergency option to be able to switch to a backup provider if your primary provider is not available without incurring the cost of, 2 fully licensed identity providers, which I think most businesses can't support. So also being able to synchronize, identities, make them portable between your different providers for like M&A situations or protracted, identity migration projects. And then even up to the point of detecting and understanding kind of these changes and trying to determine if there are some changes that were, not authorized or not intended, right? These kind of undesired or malicious changes, to be able to start the recovery process sooner, to not only detect the change, but to be able to adequately scope it so that you can start recovery as quickly as possible. I mean, these are tool-based solutions that can fit into a larger BCDR plan, but it really does start with the plan, and then, you kind of figure out where your gaps are and then work your way down to solutions.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks, Mark, for that. So that actually concludes our fireside portion of the webinar. I think we're going to head on over to the Q&A part. We already have 2 good questions in the Q&A box. Like I said, if anyone wants to ask a few more questions, I think we'll have time while we answer these first 2. But we'll go ahead and start with the first question. What challenges do organizations commonly face when trying to ensure IAM continuity during a disaster, and how can these challenges be mitigated?
Yeah, I can start off with that and the rest of the panelists can kind of jump in. But there's really 3 main challenges that we see across the board. The first one is obviously loss of network connectivity, right? So if there's ever a disaster or incident that occurs, the first thing that kind of goes down is your network infrastructure and your network technology. So it's really important that there's a good plan of action in place to kind of get that up. Obviously, when it comes to SSO and IAM solutions, the critical thing there is your credentials and offline access policies, right? So as Jerry and Mark are kind of talking about, what is going to be your policies to kind of get that transferred over and spin up into a new SSO solution. So I would say number 1 is loss of network connectivity. The second item is IAM infrastructure failure, right? So if IAM is on premise or it's not deploying redundant IAM infrastructure in different locations, as we were talking about, like high availability, if one of the regions goes down, essentially you don't have access to your IAM solution, right? So that's why it's really important, going back to having multiple regions, multiple redundancies, and multiple geographical locations when you guys are deploying any type of IAM solution in place. And then last but not least is limited access to users' data, right? So when you guys are backing up data, that data needs to be kept into different regions, obviously, but then also who has access to that data, right? So when you guys are backing up to multiple locations, we need to consider the different thought processes. So, okay, who's going to access that data if the whole system in US region is down, and now we have to spin it up in US region 2, right? And so essentially, is that level of access the same? Does that need to be modified, or does it need to be edited temporarily just to get kind of services back up and running? So I think those are really the 3 biggest challenges that we're seeing on the compliance side of house, in terms of like being able to recover from the IAM continuity issue. Anyone else on the panelists have any comments or add-on additions?
Yeah, I mean, I caution, because too often in the BCDR space, we talk about these catastrophic things, right? Vendor goes completely offline, or this data center is completely, completely goes down. I just encourage people to think of, a disaster can be as little as the recent hotel change where a customer service agent made a change that allowed someone to get a privileged access that then became this huge ransomware attack, right? And so, a disaster can start very small. It doesn't have to start with entire data center goes offline. Similarly, a disaster could be, as I talked about before, a developer deploying a script as part of their normal day-to-day business that happens to impact a large part of your business. It takes all of your customers offline. It's a disaster. It just happened to be self-inflicted. It just wasn't, an external factor. So, I do encourage people to, when you're thinking about these sort of disaster scenarios, don't just think about the classical infrastructure related data center goes offline. Disasters now can start very small and become very big. But they can start very small, right? Just with the small thing of, as I said, customer service agent gives with the wrong access to the wrong person. It can start with just as easily as that. And we are seeing that increasingly in identity space, right? Social engineering attacks, things like that. Really, it's really important to fortify your user authentication processes, especially around privileged access, right? Any type of privileged account, anything related to crippling security, such as, resetting MFA. Again, I keep coming back to this hotel change just because it's probably a little front of mind for everyone. But it did start with a very small, relatively innocuous change, cripple security on a privileged access account that led to this big sort of password grabbing, right? System penetration, and now they, own large portions of their infrastructure. So again, I just, like I said, encourage people to think a little bit more, be a little bit more open-minded in terms of how they think about disasters.
Anyone else wants to add to that? I'll go ahead and go to the next question. So the second question, which one of our guests submitted, it's been a little bit of a hot topic as of recent. What happened during the recent MGM hack? What could have gone differently?
Okay, since I've mentioned it about 3 or 4 times already, I'll take that one. Look, it's very similar to other attacks, right? It starts with, as I said, social engineering to get an exploit of a privileged account that they then used to get more access to more of the system. In this case, they grabbed user passwords and they got access to the VMs, right? And so I think the important thing to understand is there are human elements of what they could have done better, and then there are things that tools could have helped them on, right? So the human elements, of course, user identification on privileged access. They should have had very strong safeguards and railguards around the ability to cripple MFA or reset MFA, knowing that this is a way for attackers to get in. And I think there's increasingly more attention on things like that, right? Just a very risky behavior. That plus privileged access means they should have done significantly more validation on that user's identity. On the tool side, things like flagging that this change occurred. So maybe a service agent shouldn't have done this, but maybe it should have flagged that, hey, somebody did this and we need another set of eyes on it. Once they got in, the ability to detect that there are these other changes that are happening that are probably out, that are outside of normal business. And they should be able to flag those as someone should put some more eyes on it. They could have detected the issue a little bit earlier. Maybe they could have found some way to quarantine or deactivate these user accounts until they learned a little bit more about what was happening and basically control the bleeding. And then the last one is just being able to kind of get their business up and running again. So once they determine that, okay, this system is completely corrupted and they had to shut it down, now what's plan B? There is no plan. They obviously had no plan B, right? So the ability to take the identities and be able to move them to either another provider or another tenant and stand that up and be able to get access going back through that tenant, they just didn't have that, right? And so I think that there's a lot of things that they could have done better. Certainly, it is very easy for us to quarterback, armchair this Monday morning. But again, that's kind of group it into those two things. What could have been done on sort of the human process side, and then what could have been done on, more of a tool side.
Thanks, Jerry. If anyone else want to put in or?
Well, okay, so I'll just summarize, right? I mean, I think the point is those identities are extremely valuable, right? And that goes back to the whole point of like why a fabric is so important, right? And again, I don't want to Monday morning armchair this, as Jerry said, but this is why that whole concept of identity fabric is really coming into play. Like, hey, what is that path, right? It's not just BCDR, but what's a path, alternate paths.
Smart. All right, so with that, that concludes our webinar. First off, thank you so much to all our panelists, and thank you everyone who were able to join the live session, and thank you in advance to everyone who's going to be viewing the recorded session as well. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I sure did. I thought it was a great chat with a lot of useful and awesome information. With that, I'll let everyone have a great rest of their day and have a great week. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thanks.